This is a daily reality that we have to remember those in prison for the gospel. Right now, people in prison, some of you watching are in persecuted nations. Right now, people are being tortured. Now, I'm going to give you a warning because I'm going to read out of Tortured for Christ a good amount of the first few pages because I want you to see the reality. I know many of you are not going to go get the book and read it, but I'm going to warn you, this is graphic, okay? If you have kids in the room, what I'm going to read, I'm not going to show anything on screen because my video got taken down last time I did that, but I'm going to read some extremely graphic, real stories that Richard Wormbread was a personal witness to of things that happened in the underground church and when he was in prison in Romania. Again, very graphic warning here. These are very graphic stories, but they're real. I'm going to do my best to get through these. I get extremely emotional every time I read these. I tried reading them on stream last time when we did the movie. I decided not to because I just have a hard time getting through it, but I feel the Holy Spirit tonight telling me you need to read this. People need to wake up and they need to understand there is a price to pay for the gospel. And I hope that these stories help you pray for our brothers and sisters that are being persecuted. Okay, so I'm going to read this. Bear with me, guys. It is graphic. It is intense. It will probably make your stomach turn as it does mine, but it's the reality of the price to be paid for the gospel. He says, this is Richard Wormbrand writing in this story, okay? He said, I worked in both an official and underground manner until February 29th, 1948. On that beautiful Sunday, on my way to church, I was kidnapped from the street by the secret police. I'd often wondered what was meant by man-stealing, which was mentioned several times in the Bible. Communism has taught us, many at that time were kidnapped like this. A van of the secret police stopped in front of me. 4 men jumped out and pushed me into their vehicle. I was taken to a prison where I was kept secretly for over 8 years. Listen to this. During that time, no one knew whether I was alive or dead. My wife was visited by secret police who posed as released fellow prisoners. They told her that they had attended my burial. She was heartbroken. So for 8 years, he's in prison. His wife thinks he's dead. She was heartbroken. Thousands of believers from churches of all denominations were sent to prison at that time. Not only were clergymen put in jail, but also simple peasants, young boys, and girls who witnessed for their faith. The prisons were full, and in Romania, as in all communist countries, to be in prison means to be tortured, and the tortures were sometimes horrible. I prefer not to speak much about the things which I've passed. It's too painful when I do. I cannot sleep at night. In my book, God's Underground, I recount many details of our experiences with God in jail. Now, the book God's Underground is extremely graphic, more than I'm going to read you, and it wasn't able to be published massively because of how graphic it is. It wasn't mainstream published. It had to be self-published. But if you're interested on Amazon, it's called God's Underground, and I got through like the first chapter and I couldn't read any longer because it's just too graphic. But he says this. He's going to describe, again, graphic, some of the torment and the tortures that they went through so you get an idea of what these people went through. He said a pastor by the name of Florescu was tortured with red-hot iron pokers and knives. He was beaten very badly. Then starving rats were driven into a cell through a large pipe. He could not sleep because he had to defend himself constantly. If he rested for one moment, the rats would attack him. He was forced to stand up for 2 weeks. Day and night, the communists wished to compel him to betray his brethren, but he resisted steadfastly. Eventually, again, this is hard for me to read, guys. I apologize if I get emotional. Excuse me here. Eventually, they brought his 14-year-old son to the prison and they began to whip the boy in front of his father, saying that they would continue to beat the boy until the pastor said what they wanted him to say. The poor man was going half mad. He bore it as long as he could, and then he cried out to his son, Alexander, I must say what they want. I can't bear you being beat any longer. The son responded this way. This is the son's answer. Father, don't do me the injustice of having a traitor as a parent withstand. If they kill me, I will die with the words, Jesus and my fatherland. The communists in rage fell upon the child and beat the child to death in front of his father. With blood splattered all over the walls of the cell, the boy died praising God. Our dear brother Florescu was never the same after seeing this. Handcuffs with sharp nails on the insides were placed on our wrist. If we were totally still, they didn't cut us. But in bitterly cold cells, when we shook with cold, our wrists were torn by the nails. Christians were hung upside down on ropes, and they were beaten so severely their bodies swung back and forth under the blows. Christians were also placed in icebox refrigerator cells, which were so cold that frost and ice covered the inside. I was thrown into one and I had very little clothing on. The prison doctors, listen to how demented and demonic this is. The prison doctors would watch through an opening until they saw symptoms of freezing to death. Then they would signal the guards. They would rush in, take us out, make us warm. When we finally warmed up, they would immediately throw us back into the icebox cell to freeze again, thawing us out, then freezing us. Within minutes of death, they would thaw us out again and do this over and over and over. So they were literally freezing them alive, unthawing them, freezing them over and over and over again. He said, even today, there's times I can't bear to open a refrigerator. We Christians were sometimes forced to stand in wooden boxes, only slightly larger than we were, and this left no room to move. Dozens of sharp nails were driven into every side of the box with razor-sharp points sticking through the wood. While we stood perfectly still, it was all right, but we were forced to stand in these boxes for hours on end. When we became fatigued and swayed, the nails would pierce into our bodies. If we moved or we twitched a muscle, there were horrible nails that would be driven into us. What the communists have done to Christians surpasses any human understanding. I've seen communists whose face while torturing believers shone with joy. They cried out while torturing us, saying, "We are the devil, we are the devil." And this is what Richard Wurmbrand says. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers of evil. And we saw these communists not from people, but from evil. It's a spiritual force driving them, a force of evil that can only be countered by a greater spiritual force, the Spirit of God. I often ask the torturers, don't you have pity in your hearts? They usually answer with quotations from Lenin. You cannot make omelets without first cracking or breaking the shells of the eggs, and you cannot cut wood without chips flying. I said again, you know these quotations from Lenin, but there's a difference. When you cut a piece of wood, it feels nothing. But you're dealing with human beings. Every beating produces pain. There are mothers who weep. It was in vain. They are materialists. For them, nothing besides matter exists, and to them, a person's like wood, like an eggshell. With this belief, they sink into unimaginable, unthinkable depths of cruelty. The cruelty of atheism is hard to believe. When a person has no faith in the reward of good or the punishment of evil, there's no reason to be human. There's no restraint from the depths of evil that is in the human beings. The communist torturers often said there is no God, no hereafter, no punishment for evil. We can do what we wish. I heard one torturer say, I thank God, in whom I don't believe, that I've lived this hour where I can express all the evil that's inside my heart. He expressed it in unbelievable brutality and torture inflicted upon these prisoners. I'm very sorry if a crocodile eats a man, but I can't reproach the crocodile. He's not a moral being. So no reproaches can be made to these communists. Communism has destroyed any moral sense in them. They boasted that they had no pity for us in their hearts. I learned from them. Oh, this is so good. Listen to what he says right here. And some of you should write this down. He said, I learned from them. As they allowed no place for Jesus in their hearts, I decided that I would not allow no place for Satan in mine. Let me say that again. I learned this from them. As they allowed no place for Jesus in their hearts, I decided I will allow no place for Satan, even the smallest in mine. He says, I've testified before the Internal Security Subcommittee of the U.S. Senate. There I described awful things such as Christians tied to crosses for 4 days and nights. The crosses were placed on floor and hundreds of prisoners were there to fulfill bodily necessities over the faces and bodies of the crucified Christians. Then the crosses were erected again, and the communists jeered and mocked. Look at your Christ, how beautiful he is, what fragrance he brings from heaven. So they would put them on crosses, lay them on the ground, and then hundreds of prisoners would use the restroom on top of them, and then they would put them up and say, what fragrance brings from heaven. He says, I described how after being driven nearly insane with torturing, a priest was forced to consecrate human excrement. Again, this is graphic. A priest was forced to consecrate human excrement and urine and give Holy Communion to Christians with urine and feces. This happened in a Romanian prison in Pitești. I asked the priest afterwards, why did he not prefer to die than to participate in this mockery? The priest responded, don't judge me, please. I've suffered more than Christ had to suffer. All the biblical descriptions of hell and the pains of Dante's Inferno are nothing in comparison to the tortures we went through in communist prison. And then he goes, this is only a small part of what happened on Sunday and many other Sundays in the prison of Pitești. Other things simply I cannot tell. My heart would fail if I tried to tell you them over and over again. They are too terrible and they are too obscene to put into writing. This is what your brothers and sisters in Christ go through, went through, and are going through now. If I were to continue to tell you all the horrors of communist tortures and all the self-sacrifices of Christians, I would never ever finish. Not only were the tortures known, but the heroic deeds were known also. The heroic examples of those in prison greatly inspired the brethren who were still free. One of the really great heroes of the faith, Pastor Milan Hamavachi, the prisoners were overcrowded and the guards did not know us by name. They called out those who had been sentenced to get 25 lashes with a whip for having broken prison rules. innumerable times, Pastor Hemavachi went to take beatings in the place of someone else. By this, he won the respect of prisoners, not only for himself, but also for Christ, whom he represented. One of the 4 workers in the underground church was a young girl. This is like, for me, the hardest one to read right here. All right. Give me 1 second here, guys. All right. It's hard to read this. One of the workers in the underground church was a young girl. The communist police discovered that she secretly spread gospels and taught children about Christ. They decided to arrest her, but to make the arrest as agonizing and painful as they could, they waited until they delayed her arrest a few weeks until the day she was going to be married. On her wedding day, the girl was dressed as a bride, the most wonderful, joyous day in a girl's life. Suddenly, the doors burst open and the secret police rushed in. When the bride saw the secret police, listen to this, guys. Oh, give me a second. This is really hard to read. 1 second, guys. All right. Let me find where I'm at. When the bride saw the secret police, she held out her arms. Excuse me. 1 second, guys. All right, let me get this. I'm going to read this. Okay. When the bride saw the secret police, she held out her arms towards the handcuffed. They thoroughly put the manacles on her wrist. She looked towards her beloved, then kissed the chains and said, I thank my heavenly bridegroom for this jewel he's presented me on my marriage day. I thank him that I'm worthy to suffer for him. 1 second, guys. She was dragged off with weeping Christians and a weeping bridegroom left behind. They knew what happens to young Christian girls in the hands of the communist guards. Her bridegroom faithfully waited for her for 5 years after she was released. A destroyed, broken woman, she looked 30 years older, and she said it was the least she can do for her Christ. It's the least that she can do for her Christ. Such beautiful Christians are in the underground church. All right, let me keep reading here. Westerners have probably heard about brainwashing in the Korean and Vietnam wars. I've passed through horrible brainwashing myself. It's the most horrible torture. We had to sit for 17 hours a day. Listen to this, guys. We had to sit for 17 hours a day for weeks, months, and years hearing communism is good, communism is good, communism is good, Christianity is stupid, Christianity is stupid, Christianity is stupid, give up, give up, give up, give up. So 17 hours a day, this was being played to them for weeks, months, and years, he says. Several Christians asked me, how could you resist brainwashing? There's only one method of resistance to brainwashing. It is heart washing. If the heart is cleansed by the love of Jesus Christ, and if the heart loves him, one can resist all tortures. What would a loving bride not do for a loving bridegroom? What would a loving mother not do for her child? If you love Christ as Mary did, who had Christ as a baby in her arms, if you love Jesus as a bride loves her bridegroom, then you can resist such tortures. God will judge us not according to how much we endured, but how much we could love. The Christians who suffered for their faith in prisons could love. I'm a witness that they could love God and humanity. The tortures and brutality continued without interruption. When I lost consciousness or became too dazed to give the tortures any further hopes of confession, I'd be returned to my cell. There I would lie, unattended to and half dead, to regain as little strength as I could. Again, many died during this stage, but somehow my strength always managed to return. In the ensuing years, in several different prisons, they broke 4 vertebrae in my back and broke many other of my bones. They carved into me over a dozen places in my body. They burned me and they cut 18 different holes in my body. When my family and I were ransomed out of Romania and brought to Norway, doctors in Oslo, seeing all of this and scars in my lungs and from tuberculosis, declared that me being alive today is a pure miracle. According to the medical books, I should have been dead for years. I know myself that it was a miracle. God is a God of miracles. I believe God performed this wonder so that you could hear my voice crying out on behalf of the underground church and persecuted countries. He allowed one to come out alive and cry, excuse me. He allowed one to come out alive and cry the aloud message of your suffering faithful brethren. It was strictly forbidden to preach to other prisoners as it is in captive nations today. We're almost done reading this here. As it was understood that whoever was caught received a severe beating, a number of us decided to pay the price for the privilege of preaching. So we accepted their terms. It was a deal. We preached and they beat us. We were happy preaching and they were happy beating us. Everyone was happy. The following scene happened to me more times than I can remember. A brother was preaching to the other prisoners when the guards suddenly burst in, surprising him halfway through a phrase. They hauled him down the corridor to the beating room. After a seemed to be endless beating, they would bring him back and throw his bloody and bruised body on the floor. Slowly, he would pick up his battered body, painfully straightened his clothing and said, "So, brethren, where did I leave off when I was interrupted?" And he would continue to preach the gospel message. One great lesson arose from all the beatings, tortures, and butchery of the communists: that the spirit is the master of the body. We felt the torture, but it often seemed as something distant and far removed from the spirit, which was lost in the glory of Christ and the presence with us. When we were given one slice of bread each week and a dirty soup every day, we decided to faithfully tithe. Give me 1 second, guys. When we were given one slice of bread a week, and dirty soup every day, we decided that we would tithe even that. Every 10th we took the slice of bread and we gave it to a weaker brethren as a tithe to the master. Again, guys, this is so far off from American Christianity. Okay, let's keep reading. We're almost done. When one Christian was sentenced to death, he was allowed to see his wife once before being executed. His last words to his wife were, "You must know that I die loving those who kill me. They don't know that what they do, and my last request of you is to love them. Don't have bitterness." Don't have bitterness in your heart because they've killed your beloved. We will meet in heaven. These words impressed the officer of the secret police who attended the discussion between the two. He later told me the story in prison where he had been sent for becoming a Christian. So the officer got saved hearing that and was later sent and became a Christian, was sent to prison. A total of 14 years in prison passed for me. So 14 years he was tortured. So a total of 14 years in prison passed for me. During all this time, I never saw a Bible or any other book. 14 years, guys. I'd forgotten how to write because of the starvation, drugging, and the torturers. I'd forgotten the Holy Scriptures, but on the day that I fulfilled 14 years, listen to this, okay? So he forgot Scripture, he was starving, he was tortured for 14 years. On the day I fulfilled the 14 years, out of oblivion, came into my mind the verse, Genesis 29:20. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed but a few days to him because of the love that he had for her. Very soon after this, I was released through a general amnesty given in our country, very much under the influence of American public opinion. I saw my wife again. She had waited faithfully for me for 14 years. He said, we began our new life in poverty because those who are arrested have had everything taken from them. 14 years he was tortured for the gospel. Guys, this is what I'm talking about. This is so far off from what we preach, from what we listen to, from the sermons being preached on Sunday morning. I know the whole chat is pretty much saying they're crying, but this is the reality of people being tortured. And these stories I'm reading you are not even scratching the surface to what's happening right now in so many countries and so many Christians. And so for me as a preacher, I get emotional because I'm sitting in my studio and I'm freely preaching. I'm not paying for it. I'm not being persecuted. Sure, someone made a video about me. Who cares? And these people are being tortured. And the writer of Hebrews says, remember them as if you yourself were in prison. He says those that are being beat as if it was pain in your own body. He goes, remember them as if it was in pain in your own body. And so that book is Tortured for Christ. The other book that he references is God's Underground, which is extremely more graphic. I might try to go back and read it now. I tried reading it probably 7 years ago, and I didn't get through the first 2 pages because it's extremely graphic, but you need to read Tortured for Christ. It's an incredible book, and we need to always remember these Christians